Thank you for the for inviting me. Um, I'm a registered dietitian, and I do research at University of Otago Christchurch. And my research is predominantly around diet and nutrition and gastrointestinal disorders and diseases. I also am a consultant dietitian at a private practice and work at Christchurch Hospital, mostly in outpatient, seeing people with Crohn's disease or ulcerative colitis. I'll share. And I suppose actually the reason that I connected with Rose is for the last couple of years we've been doing some research looking at trying to better understand chronic fatigue in people who have chronic inflammatory conditions. And some of and we applied to ANZ MES for some funding, and so I was talking with Rose about that. That wasn't successful, but we're continuing to apply to other organisations to do some more research looking into maybe how nutrition might influence how the cells in the body produce energy, and how that might be related to how we experience fatigue. So some of that may be relevant to some people with MECFS, but as we were talking before, there's lots of different ways of how people present or what their predominant symptoms may be. So today I am going to share my screen. Great. So I'm going to talk about diet and the gut microbiome in MECFS. And there should be some time at the end for some questions. So I will sort of give an overview of what the gut microbiome is in like simple terms as I can, talk about some of the literature around the gut microbiome and MECFS, also about what we know from research that's been done into dietary intake in people with MECFS, a bit about diet and the gut microbiome and how these interact, and finish with some tips that might help to promote a more diverse gut microbiome. And then there should be some time to ask some questions and have a general chat around these topics. So the gut microbiota, what is this? So the definition is that it's a collection of microbes that live in the gut. This includes bacteria, fungi, viruses, archaea, eukarya, and so all of these microbes, and then they're grouped into families based on their characteristics or functions. How they're based may not be quite accurate because some of these microbes were identified many years ago when maybe our technology wasn't as good as our technology has evolved. We've realized, oh, actually, maybe they're not the best fit. But anyway, this is what it is. They're classified according to their phylum, which is like their wider family, their genera, which is say like their immediate family, and then species, which is more of their individual characteristics. So for example, fecal bacterium Praunitzi, the firmicutes is its phyla, the genera is this fecal bacterium, and then species is Praunitzi. This bacteria is quite well known as it's often low in groups of people who we would classify as dysbiosis, and I'll mention more about that later. And then this here is also another example. So Acinetobacteria is the phylum, the genera is Bifidobacterium, and then the species is Animalis lactis. And this is a really common microbe that we see in yogurt, for example. And when we're looking at, say, like a probiotic, there'll always be this information, and then there'll also be another number afterwards, which is the strain, which is even more specific, and that gives us more detail around what it actually does. So I should have added strain there as well. So that's the gut microbiota. It's the name for the microbes that live in the gut. Then we have the gut microbiome, which is the genomes of the microbes that live in the gut. So genomes is the genes and the genetic material of those microbes. So the gut microbiome tells us what is present, but also what it can do or what it is doing. So it's sort of like that next level. You may have these microbes present, but what are they actually doing? And the microbiome research tells us more information about that. And then we also have the gut metabolome, and these are the metabolites that the microbes produce in response to their environment. So for example, diet, we can measure what metabolites or compounds the microbes produce when they are degrading different parts of our diet. And we'll talk a little bit more about that. Just sort of to give an example of gut metabolome, we did a study in people with constipation, either IBS, constipation predominant or functional constipation. And in the study, we fed people 2 green kiwi fruit every day for a week, and then they had a couple of weeks off, and then we fed them psyllium husk for 4 weeks. And then we looked at the change in the gut microbiota and what metabolites they were producing and what their function was. So here is just an example of some of the data, but what I want to highlight here is that when we gave people psyllium, all of these different enzymes that are produced by the microbes changed because we had changed what was available in the gut for the microbes to break down. Whereas when we gave them kiwi fruit, the gene functions of those microbes didn't change significantly in terms of in result of those fibres. However, the microbes that break down polyphenols and vitamins and minerals that are in the kiwi fruit, their functions changed, but in response to fibre, we only saw changes in the psyllium. We didn't see any changes in the function of the microbes that look at polyphenols, because psyllium doesn't have any polyphenols. So diet can have a really big impact on what those microbes are doing and what metabolites are being produced, which we think then has an impact on how people feel and how their gut functions. Hope that kind of makes sense. So leading on to that, what is like a healthy gut microbiome? We know that from what we hear in the popular media that that healthy gut microbiome is really important, but what does that mean? And I think that this graph here really shows gives us an idea that we can't really say what a healthy gut microbiome is. So this was some research that looked at 800 different people from 12 different countries. The color of the dots is a different country. So all these red ones here are Japan. All of these blue ones here are from the US. And what this figure is showing is that the gut microbiome, the composition varies between countries. So we can see all the red dots are clustered over here and all the green dots are clustered over here. But also each of these dots is a different person, so that we can see that in Japan, there's quite a lot of variability between people. but there seems to be more variability between countries than there is between people living in those countries. So why is this? It's going to be due in part to the traditional diets of those countries. So dietary intake in Japan is very different to the hamburger and pizza predominant dietary intake in the US, for example. It's also going to be influenced by early life experiences, so exposure to antibiotics, whether or not breastfeeding or bottle feeding is more common. It's affected by health conditions. So we often see that in conditions where there is inflammation, that what this microbiome looks like is quite different between people who don't have diabetes, for example, and those who do have diabetes. It's also different between people who have gut symptoms and people who don't have gut symptoms. It's impacted by stress, pollution, physical activity. All of these things influence the type of microbes in the gut and what they're doing. So you can see that it's not straightforward. If you are looking at or reading about the gut microbiome, one of the things that's often reported is these measures of diversity. And I'll show you some data in a moment from people with MECFS. But just to give you an idea of what these measures of diversity are actually telling us. I really like this graphic because I think it puts it in nice, easy and simple to understand way. So on the left here, this is an example of a gut microbiome with low richness and low evenness. So there's only 3 different types of fruit here, and there's more apples and less pears and oranges. This here is, so this would have low, what we call alpha diversity. This here is an example where there's similar low richness. There's only 3 different types of fruit, but it's more even because there's 2 of each. So similar abundance of each of those different types. In this third example, we have high richness. So there's 7 different types of fruit, but there's lots of apples and not so many of the other ones. So this would be a microbiome that has many different types of bacteria, but more of one type of bacteria and less of some of the others. Whereas the example on the far right is one with high alpha diversity, so it has 7 different types of fruit, and they're quite even. There's similar abundance of each of those types. And at the moment, this is what we think, well, this is what we've seen in the literature. It tends to be associated with good health, whereas the low richness and the less abundance tends to be associated with poorer health. And this is also what we tend to classify as dysbiosis, which is probably a term that you've heard, gut dysbiosis. But what does this mean? It can be any one of these 4 or a combination of these. So it could be an imbalance of microbes, so where you have more of one type and less of some of the other types. It could be changes in their functional composition. So there is diversity or richness, but maybe they're not doing the job as well as would be expected, or they're not producing the same metabolites as in the previous example that would be expected, or there's a change in where they're found in the gut. So if you've heard of something called small bacterial overgrowth, that is where we have increased numbers of microbes in an area of the gut that usually has lower amounts, and then this changes how those microbes function and affects the balance and and their activities as well. So that's sort of a little bit of background to, and like sort of broad around gut microbiota, microbiome, and diversity, and what we mean by that. So what do we know at the moment about the gut microbiome in people with MECFS? So this, I'm going to present some data from a review article that was just published this year, and it summarizes the data from 11 different studies that have been done from 6 different countries. Most of these studies do come from the USA. So if we're thinking about that previous picture, this one here, you're thinking that the gut microbiome in the USA is maybe different to what we see in other countries. So just sort of keeping that in mind. And includes 553 participants with MECFS, and then compared with 480 healthy participants. The average age was around 44 years, average BMI around 24, which is what is seen in most of the MECFS literature. Interestingly, in 4 of these studies, they reported on the proportion of people that had irritable bowel syndrome, IBS, and this was much more common in people with MECFS compared with healthy participants, which you'd expect. Well, you'd expect there's a low prevalence in healthy participants because that would have been part of the definition of being in the study. Another 4 studies also reported GI disturbances, so GI symptoms. And again, this was a little bit more common in those with MECFS compared to the healthy participants. And this is the summary of those 11 studies. So we can see here that some of the studies had slightly more participants, and some studies actually had very few. In the gut microbiome literature, because there is that huge difference in microbiome between individuals, the larger the numbers, the more confident we can be in what we're seeing, because there is that heterogeneity between people. But what we can see here is the alpha diversity, which is what I was mentioning before around the abundance and evenness. And in these larger studies, they saw lower alpha diversity in those with MECFS compared to the healthy controls. In some of the slightly smaller studies, they didn't see any difference in alpha diversity. And some of the studies didn't report alpha diversity, which is those blank boxes. In the red boxes here, we have beta diversity, and this is a measure of how similar the microbiomes are between the 2 groups. And we can see in these larger studies here that the microbiomes were very different between the 2 groups, whereas some other studies didn't report it, and only 1 study saw that there wasn't any difference between in the beta diversity between groups. So this is sort of the most recent summary, and there have been some headlines recently around there might be a signature, a microbiome signature for MECFS. I think we just have to be really careful around, how similar is, where is that research being done, and how similar is their environment to what we're living in here in New Zealand, given that there is that difference between countries. But it's an emerging field, and I'm sure we're going to see lots more around this in the coming years. Also in this paper, just before I move on, this sort of dysbiosis that we're reporting in some of these larger studies, as I said before, this is seen in many different groups. And also, especially if we're looking at, say, those who have gut symptoms versus those that don't have gut symptoms, there's also different patterns there as well. Also in this review paper, they presented some of the differences in the metabolites. So that's what are the compounds that the microbes in the gut are producing. And what this figure here is showing is that these compounds or metabolites on this side are ones that were higher in samples from those with MECFS compared to healthy controls, and the ones on the right are the compounds that were lower in those with MECFS versus controls. These ones at the top were taken from fecal samples. These ones were taken from blood samples, and these ones were in urine samples. This was only data from 5 studies, so it is quite small numbers of people, but it shows us some interesting ideas. What it's showing here is that in these fecal samples, there were lower concentrations of branched chain and short chain fatty acids, and these are usually produced by the microbes in response to different types of dietary fibres. And so in the MECFS stool samples, these were much lower than healthy controls. There's also differences, lower concentrations of some of these amino acids. And one that I found quite interesting is that in urine samples, there's lower pyruvate and there's also lower lactate in the plasma samples. And these metabolites have been, they're associated with some of those energy producing cycles in the cells. So these are byproducts of energy production and maybe telling us something around the capacity of cells to produce energy. Again, these are just a small number of samples, but give us some interesting insights into what might be going on in the gut microbiome. So what are our sort of conclusions to date? As I mentioned, this is an emerging area of research. That review only had 11 studies, but there'll be a lot more being undertaken at the moment. It's likely that there is gut dysbiosis, which is in keeping with what we see in other chronic conditions as well. The gut microbiome signature may vary by region, and that is, again, with more research, we'll have a better understanding of that. And also it might be that that the gut microbiome also varies by different phenotypes of MECFS. So, for example, the presence of gut symptoms or not, what the initial trigger may have been. So these are also questions that will be interesting to see what comes out in the future. And there may also be that we can use dietary strategies to influence the gut microbiome. And this is definitely a future research interest that hasn't been looked at yet. That kind of nicely sort of moves on to dietary intake and MECFS and the potential for dietary intake to influence the gut microbiome. When I had a look at the literature, this was the only study that I could find. There may have been others done in the past, but this was published in 2021. And I thought it was relevant to share this with you because it was done in Australia. And dietary intake in Australia is more likely to be similar to New Zealand compared with, say, dietary intake in the US. So in this study, they assessed dietary intake and supplement use in 24 Australians with MECFS, and then compared that data with lots of data from the Australian Health Survey. Those with MECFS, the average age was 43, 79% were female, and 20% were unemployed, which gives us an idea of may give us an idea of severity of symptoms. And people completed questionnaires about their supplement use and dietary intake. Some of their findings were that supplement use was really common, as I'm sure that you would agree with. 87% of people were taking some kind of supplements, compared with a third of the general Australian population. Taking micronutrient supplements was also much more common. So 70% of people were taking micronutrients, compared with 10% of Australians. And these were the most common supplements that were used. So probiotics, vitamin D, zinc, magnesium, CoQ10 and melatonin were also commonly used. And in terms of dietary intake, they assessed diet intake using a food frequency questionnaire, which is commonly how we assess diet intake in studies of this design. And then they compared that with the intake from the Australian Health Survey. People with MECFS were more likely to eat gluten-free grains than the general Australian population. And when looking at micronutrient intake, tended to have consume less vitamin B6, less B9, which is folic acid or folate, and less B12, which is also in grain products. They're fortified with B12. Tended to eat more berries and fruit and vegetables than the general Australian population, so had higher intake of vitamin C, folate, which is the natural form of B9 in food, potassium and magnesium. People with MECFS also tended to drink more herbal teas and more water than the general population, and had a higher fat intake, mostly from oils, which also meant that then they had a higher vitamin E intake, because oils is where we get most of our vitamin E in the diet. And they also tended to consume more caffeine than the general population. They were less likely to drink alcohol, less likely to eat sweet biscuits, and less likely to consume enough iodine, which is particularly of concern in New Zealand, because our soils are naturally low in iodine. And so in New Zealand, our main source of iodine is from iodized salt. Also, people with MECFS had a lower carbohydrate intake compared with the general population. And this feeds back into that lower intake of some of those B vitamins and carbohydrates. Most of this was probably driven by the lower intake of grains and maybe higher intake of non-starchy vegetables, which don't contribute much to our carbohydrate intake. And tended to have higher dietary fibre intakes, probably driven by that higher intake of fruits and vegetables rather than fibres coming from grains or legumes. And so I think this is kind of interesting, and I'd be interested to hear your thoughts when we have questions afterwards about whether or not you think this kind of eating pattern is also what we see in New Zealand. So this kind of leads us on to, is there a link between dietary intake and the gut microbiome? And there's been quite a lot in the media, as well as in the research literature, around diversity of dietary intake, and does having a diverse diet that includes lots of different plant foods, which are our sources of dietary fibers and vitamins and minerals and polyphenols, does this actually result in a more diverse gut microbiome? So just from these titles, we can see that this is a topic of discussion. Diversifying your diet portfolio, potential impacts of dietary diversity on the gut microbiome and human health. We don't really have a good way yet of measuring what is a diverse diet. There's relationships between dietary diversity and the gut microbiome in the elderly. Grain, gluten, dietary fibre intake influence gut microbial diversity. So again, it's that variety of those dietary fibres. And then I think this one here is a really important idea. Tuning expectations to reality. Don't expect increased gut microbiota diversity with dietary fibre. So really this paper is talking about, if we just give psyllium husk, then we'll see changes related to psyllium husk. Whereas if we give dietary fibres in a food form, then there's much more natural variety in those dietary fibres and foods. So just giving a supplement probably isn't going to get us the results that we want. So with that in mind, what do we define as a diverse diet? What's our understanding at the moment? And at the moment, we define this as getting a variety of varied sources of dietary fibre from a variety of different plant foods. So just to give you some examples, dietary fibre is a really heterogeneous group of different compounds. So these are some examples of different dietary fibres that we see in foods. And I don't expect you to be reading all of this, but really just looking at maybe the different shapes of these, the different configurations of how they're put together, is what I'm trying to highlight. In red that you may not be able to see, these are different enzymes that are needed to be able to break down these different foods, and these enzymes are what are produced, or some of which are produced by the microbes that live in our gut, and some of the enzymes that we need are also secreted within our gut. And as we saw in that first, where I presented some of the results from the psyllium trial, we saw that there was an upregulation in some of those enzymes that are needed to break down psyllium husk. So here we have arabinoxylan, that we get, which is a predominant fibre that's in many of our different grains. Here we have beta-fructans, which are in a variety of vegetables, wheat, onions, garlic. B-glucan, which is in oats and rice. Pectin, which is really high in particular fruits and vegetables and nuts. Cellulose, which is the plant walls that make up fruits and vegetable skins. And lignin, which is in vegetables, flax seeds, grains. And so it's this variety of these different fibres that we get from the different food groups that we think help promote a more diverse diet. These different fibres, these are the same ones again, but with some pretty pictures, have different impacts on the gut microbiome. So consuming B-fructans, for example, increases the activity of these particular species of bacteria that then results in short-chain fatty acids. Beta-fructans, for example, are broken down more by these types of bacteria, and they tend to produce butyrate as part of doing that. So the different fibres are broken down by different types of microbes, and some microbes may shift what they're doing and adapt to their environment. And then it produces metabolites that we think help to maintain the health of the gut lining, help to reduce inflammation. And then these are also transported throughout the body and have effects on our mental health, as well as other effects within our body too. So what does all this kind of mean, and where are we up to in terms of what we know in the literature, what we know about diets, what we know about like the chemistry of food, and how the microbes in our gut use this, and what they produce in response to that. I suppose at the moment, we assume that having a more varied and a more diverse diet will promote a more varied gut microbiome. But at the moment, we probably don't have the science to support that. So what can I recommend right now? I think overall, we should all be trying to increase our diversity of plant foods in our diet. The general New Zealand diet is pretty unhealthy and doesn't meet sort of our basic recommendations. And so anything that we can do to increase that diversity is going to be helpful from a nutrition perspective, if not from a gut microbiome perspective. And by that, I mean within a food group. So having different types of vegetables as the seasons change, so that over a year we're having more variety rather than eating the same vegetables all year. Also having different colors, because they're going to have different types of dietary fibres and different nutrient profiles. And also diversity between food groups, so fruit, vegetables, nuts, seeds, grains, and a variety of grains within that food group. So that could include wheat, oats, barley, quinoa, millet, sorghum. What else have I forgotten? So there's lots of different grains that could include. And that's also going to provide us, again, with more varied nutrient intake and more likely to be meeting our basic nutrition requirements. I think that we need to acknowledge that some foods may promote more gut symptoms, and if gut symptoms is part of what you experience, then tweaking how much you may have of one particular food may be necessary. But we really want to avoid long-term cutting out whole food groups or whole types of foods, because the literature to date suggests that that may promote more dysbiosis. And so with that in mind, when I'm working with people who are having gut symptoms, we may, rather than completely taking a food that may trigger symptoms out, we'll reduce the amount and maybe add in some variety of other foods within that food group that don't promote gut symptoms. And then by reducing that amount, then it results in less gut symptoms, but still helps to maintain the gut's ability to digest and process that food. And then long term, that usually helps to improve tolerance. I think that also what's really important when we're thinking about diet and trying to include a varied diet that is healthy, that those pacing strategies around meal preparation, snacks, planning, trying to prepare things more in bulk when you do have the capacity, is really important, because when we're not feeling great, or when we've run out of capacity, the ability to then think about preparing something healthier is just out of reach. And so that meal and snack planning ahead, I've found has been really helpful for people with chronic fatigue syndrome who are trying to improve their overall nutrition intake, which then also helps with their capacity as well. So overall, just sort of summarizing that into a picture, what does a diverse diet look like? We've got different colors of our fruits and vegetables, and then changing that with the seasons, which I think we're really fortunate in New Zealand to that is still how our food system works. But also including adequate amounts of our grains, nuts, seeds, legumes, because these are our second largest food group in terms of volume of food. And then we've got our animal proteins or our plant-based proteins, and then with our ready-to-eat ultra-processed foods, processed meats, quick and easy grab foods, more in the much smaller proportions and less frequent. So I hope that has provided you with some ideas, and then hopefully we can have a discussion or have a few questions.
Well, thank you for that. That was great to have that walkthrough. It really was. Yeah, there's a lot of big terms there to use, aren't there? Yeah.
Yeah,
But,
hopefully I've put it in like more simple,
yeah,
understandable ideas.
yeah, you did. Has anyone got any questions right now for Catherine, or want to share something about your journey with your diet?
Yeah. Can you hear me?
Yes, hi Joe.
Hi. Hey, thanks, Rose and Catherine. I really appreciate it. Um, I'm sort of very interested to listen to this, because I've been bedridden and it's been a real struggle. But I haven't been able to prepare food. I live by myself, and at times I've been living on up and go really because that's all I could manage, and just taking it back to bed. But I went with a friend to a natural health shop, and she recommended the greens powder, and I started on that because I was so desperate. I started on that, and it made a massive difference. And then I thought that, oh well, if that helps, trying to and then I was also making smoothies with the fresh ground flaxseed and banana with the greens powder. So I got the super reds powder as well. So, and that's helped again because I think looking at that, going back to one of the first slides about the fruit and the having lots of variety of fruit, it just seems to tie in, with the I think it's got 10 organic super reds in it, and it's definitely made a difference. And just having like nice Vogel's bread and a lot of supplements. So it's somebody I was on Facebook the other day, and they said, is the super reds powder better than just having just like putting berries in your smoothie? And I thought, oh, like you can buy the frozen berries, but yeah, I'm just probably I'm thinking that the organic 10 organic super reds is probably better than just throwing frozen berries in, where I just think it's, do you think that the sprays probably factor into health issues as well?
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question. And it's that, I mean, having those powders has really increased not only your intake of, it's increased some of your intake of those active compounds that we get in our fruits and vegetables, like those polyphenols that I mentioned. And it's adding in that variety. Whether or not that an organic powder versus a whole food, we don't really have any research that's comparing those head to head. And so it may be that they both have their benefits, and that a little bit of both is going to give you even more benefit than all of one and none of the other. The whole fruit is also going to have more of those dietary fibres, whereas the powder isn't going to have all of the dietary fibres that you'd get in the whole fruit, but it is more concentrated with some of the other things you get in the fruit. So I like to think that a little bit of everything is going to be more beneficial than all of something and nothing of something else. Your other question was around like your sprays. Generally with the dried fruit, the frozen fruit, I would always go for a New Zealand frozen fruit over some of the imported fruits, just because we know more about the food system here and what's allowed. And you're not always going to be able to get New Zealand frozen fruit. So the sprays in those, I'm not sure what sort of impact that's going to have. But I feel much more confident with New Zealand frozen fruit than imported ones because of we know it's grown here and what regulations it's under. Does that answer the question?
Yeah, it does. Thank you.
But great that you're finding benefit from the powders. I do find a lot of people also have the same experience.
Thank you. Yeah.
Well, it makes those food groups a bit more accessible, isn't it, when we're trying to manage our meal preparation? Yeah, so sounds good. If anyone else has a question, feel free to type it into the chat as well. If you don't want to talk, speak out.
I've got another question.
Sorry, go Jo.
Nobody else has. Do you think with what I'm doing at the moment that I have any need to buy like your probiotic or prebiotic drinks, or is that sort of a big marketing thing?
The probiotics, at the start, I mentioned about how there's species and then there's also strain, which is like the numbers that you might see on them. The probiotics, if you've got the right strain for what you're using it for, then it can work really well. If it's not strain specific, then it's probably not doing what you hope, and so it may not be worthwhile. If you're using a probiotic for a specific reason, then it can work really well. I wouldn't just recommend getting a general probiotic. I think that you could spend your money on other things more wisely. With the prebiotics, what they are is they are like, for example, we would call what's a good example? Inulin, for example, is a prebiotic, so that's a type of fibre that we get in some of our foods, and that then promotes bacteria to produce those short-chain fatty acids. Depending on whether or not you experience gut symptoms, some of the probiotics might be in a dose that might promote symptoms for you. I tend to think that we're better to try and consume a little bit of food that contains those prebiotics. The Up and Go probably contains inulin, so you're already getting a prebiotic in the Up and Goes, for example, because they're often added to a lot of foods.
Great, thank you.
I was just going to ask about the whole carbohydrate versus low-fat diet thing, because like I've actually got diabetes, and what I see these days watching Zoe podcasts is very different to what I was taught 20 years ago about how to manage diabetes, which was to keep the fat as low as possible. And now I'm being told it should be balanced for the general population at least. So I was quite interested to see in your survey in Australia that the many people were eating a higher fat diet, because that's kind of what I find works for me now too. So just wondering whether for diabetics that's changed, that low-fat diet recommendation, or has just no one done any research on it since?
There's been quite a lot of research in diabetes, and I may not be up to date with the latest thinking, but when I was working in diabetes, which was like 15 years ago, we were sort of focused on moderate fat, more around like your healthy oils like canola oil, olive oil, things like your tahini, avocado, rather than fats that are on like a red meat or a chicken, for example. But also ensuring that you're having adequate amounts of dietary fibre, so those whole grain carbs, and balanced amounts of like your starchy vegetables, so that then that helps with blood glucose control. So yeah, that sort of balance of, say for your main meal, you've got some vegetables, some starchy carbohydrates, whether or not they're starchy vegetables or rice or pasta or quinoa or bread, and then a similar portion of your protein, whether or not that's fish, chicken, meat, tofu, whatever you happen to be having, so that it's more balanced and not just a bowl of pasta with some tomato sauce.
Yeah. So it did trickle into the diabetes world too. Yeah. No, thanks for that. Yeah, I'm finding quinoa's working well for me now, I think. You do have to have olive oil with it to make it taste any good.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, you definitely want the food to taste good. Because otherwise, if you're going to eat, you want to be enjoying what you're eating. Yeah.
Now, there's a question from Louise. Most foods that are healthy seem to be expensive. What do you suggest? I have a history of dietary issues and am currently on a low FODMAP diet. Sorry, my audio doesn't work. Yeah.
We had this similar comment at a meeting I was at last week. When we look at the data around food cost, a lot of the foods that make up a healthy diet are cheap and accessible, but also some of the more modern like healthy sort of foods are expensive. So there is a range between basic foods such as canned beans and legumes, your basic fruits and vegetables that are in season, which are quite affordable when we compare them with a lot of the ready-to-eat prepackaged foods that come under that more ultra-processed food category that was at the top of the pyramid, which are really quite expensive. So it is that balance between buying basic ingredients that then we can put together to prepare a meal, and that's where often we have to do those things in bulk when we have the energy to do that, versus the more expensive things which are ready to eat, and anything that's ready to eat is going to be more expensive, whether it's more under your like healthy category or under your more junk food category. So I think that there is this perception that healthy foods are more expensive, but when we take into account all the other things that we might be spending our money on, or the literature doesn't necessarily agree with that. A lot of the fatty foods are expensive, but the basics are still quite affordable. But yeah, it's that balance between being able to have the energy to prepare them versus being able to grab something that is already prepared. Yeah,
I suppose like olive oil is a bit more expensive than a cheaper oil. There are a few key things, I suppose, aren't there? Some of our people would buy frozen packs of chopped vegetables, for roasting or something like that. Yeah, I mean, frozen food is still of reasonable quality, isn't it?
Frozen
yeah,
food is of
yeah.
excellent quality.
Mm.
A lot of the food is snap frozen, or it's prepared fresh and then frozen. And so in terms of its nutrients, it's going to have more nutrients than something that has been picked and then stored in a fridge and then transported to the supermarket and then sat on the supermarket shelf for a week and then sat in your fridge for another week. So frozen foods, canned foods, much more affordable, ready to use, and probably have more nutrition. Yep.
Louise, do you want to
Did you have a question about the low FODMAP?
I guess if you're avoiding gluten, that often increases the cost of food, doesn't it? Gluten-free breads or other options, yeah, seem to be a bit pricier.
Yeah, unless you've got someone who's amazing and can make you some bread and bring it along, or you use some of those other grains, like Peter was mentioning, like your quinoa, your rices, your naturally gluten-free grains. That also helps to reduce the cost. And it may be that it depends on the individual person, but it may be that that you can reintroduce small amounts of wheat without exacerbating symptoms, but that will depend on whether or not it's gluten that's causing the issue or whether or not it's some of those beta fructans that I mentioned earlier, some of those dietary fibres.
I thought it was interesting that you talked about or mentioned that the research had shown we have less B12 in our gut, or is that what you said earlier?
Lower intake, yeah.
Lower intake, sorry. Lower intake, okay.
I think that came from probably because a lot of our grain foods are fortified with B12. So if you're not eating some of those grain products, then that will result in lower B12. We get most of our B12 from, we get all of our B12 from animal products, except for those foods that are fortified.
Okay.
So as long as you are having some animal products, whether or not that's meat, fish, chicken, dairy products, then your B12 intake should be fine. If you're avoiding those foods, then that's something to chat with your GP about, because you may need a supplement. Well, you will need a supplement.
There is an old-fashioned option there, because that's why Vegemite and Marmite were brought in years ago, was largely to provide you with those B vitamins.
Right.
Yeah, so that's an example of food that's fortified with B12. Yeah.
Interesting you should say that, because when I started having Marmite on toast, that it did actually help. So yeah, I do. Yeah.
And the B vitamins are really, we need adequate amounts of those B vitamins for our cells to produce energy. So that's what we're looking at in the research that we're doing at the moment is, if we, is there enough B vitamins in the system, and are those processes in the cells working well with the B vitamins that are present?
Yeah, because a lot of clinicians that work with people with MECFS, they do recommend B12 often as injections, actually. And it does help some people, but not others. Others report not the same effect. So yeah, it is an area of interest, isn't it? Yeah. Okay, well, we've reached just after 1 o'clock, so I'm sure you've got things to do, Catherine. We're very grateful for your time today and for this time to have a discussion too. It really helps to process what we've just heard and think about what the next steps we can take. Yeah. So yeah, thank you so much.
You're welcome. My pleasure.
Today. Yeah.